for this nice introduction. The man I'm introducing to you is Leo the Great. I'm not asking whoever has read anything by Leo the Great, because it might be a sad moment of how this great Pope is underappreciated and underrepresented on so many levels. Today we look at him as someone who had a lot of experience with synods. You might say, as opposed to us. We cannot compete with him. He's totally in a different league. In fact, his life, you could say, is something like a synodal life. Like, it starts with normality in Rome. Leo grows up, or at least as a young person at the latest comes to Rome, and has a long clerical career, so to say. So we must assume that even before he was a deacon, but certainly as a deacon, and then as a bishop, he participated in many regular synods. This is just what they do in Rome in his time, nothing to write home about. And in fact, we know that it happened. We don't know so much what happened exactly through the years. But then comes 449. A catastrophe in a sense, or certainly a failure on all fronts. The famous council of Ephesus that he will famously call Latrocinium, the robber synod. He also says, it cannot and does not deserve to have the name of a synod, even though it was one and it very much looked like one. After 449, takes a bit of a skeptical approach, right? Before the whole thing about making Chalcedon happen is decided, he gets in touch with the emperors and says, should we really have another council? Wasn't the last one proof that that's a bad idea? He kind of wants to dissuade them from even convoking another council, in the sense that we have so much mess caused by one. Do we really think a new council is the best way of cleaning that up? However, he doesn't get his way. The new emperors insist that the council has to happen, and Leo adapts and changes into figuring out how to make sure that it doesn't go badly. If we have to have it, it needs to be prepared well, it needs to be steered, it needs to be governed and directed. Chalcedon goes as it goes. Many of us will know something about it. It goes fairly well. It doesn't go that well, right? He's not completely happy with some of the canons. And not only for that reason, this is too much, he needs to do a lot of work afterwards. The business the council leaves behind is very unfinished on all levels. Not only the canons with which he doesn't agree and which he never formally ratifies, but also the doctrinal decision, the faith of Chalcedon, needs a lot of work. And by some important churches, it is never fully accepted even today. But we need to take a step back before we dive into Leo himself and remember that there is the mother of all councils already out there 100 years earlier, Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea 325, next year, the big Jubilee. I give you these two pictures here also to see, compared to the one we will look at the very end of the talk, how over the centuries this has kind of, iconographically evolved. On the left, you see one of the depictions of the councils, the first one obviously from the Salone Sistino, that's in the Vatican. Everyone looks like a Latin bishop. In the middle, certainly, the whole thing is run by two cardinals and another bishop in the middle. The emperor, do you even see him? I mean, he's there, right? Over here, the emperor, as much as he's even in the picture. And the deacon, still very much in Latin, reading stuff, maybe reading Leo's Thomus. On the right, on the other hand, everyone looks like an Eastern bishop, so that's in a sense more true. But in the middle, the emperor himself is enthroned. You see how these depictions, right, say a lot of how Nicaea was understood and received. Also pay attention that there is actually something else in the middle of the church where they meet, in the middle of the assembly, right? Like the book of the Gospels with the crucifix, with the cross, or then on the other side, a statue. For Leo, Nicaea is crucial, and he will often refer to it. And there is in Nicaea itself the fifth canon, which speaks about clergy and laity in the various provinces who have been excommunicated. Those would be lapsi, substantially, right, at the time. People who have fallen away from the faith during the persecutions, which were barely ended. 325 is not much after the persecutions have ended. The bishop should observe the provision of the canon, which states that someone excommunicated by one bishop is not to be readmitted by another. Commonsensical rule. Nevertheless, he should investigate to see if the excommunication has come about from excessive stringency, contentiousness, or any other ungracious attitude on the part of the excommunicating bishop. So, Nicaea is concerned that too many people get excommunicated. So they err on the side of over-excommunicating. Not exactly a description of our present church. And this is the recipe by which this should be remedied. So that these matters be duly investigated, we decree that in every province councils shall be held twice a year, so that when all the bishops of the province are assembled together, all such questions may be thoroughly examined by them. In this way, everyone can see how those who have confessedly offended their bishop have been justly excommunicated, until it shall seem fit to the general meeting of the bishop to pronounce a milder sentence upon them. Look, the council says these synods serve, first of all, a purpose of investigation. So that would be inquisition in Latin. Inquisition needs to happen. And it needs to happen regularly, twice a year, because we need to do a good job thoroughly. We need to be transparent. Everyone can see. But again, the repetition is because we've probably been too harsh. We may have cases where a milder sentence is appropriate. And therefore, very concretely, the first of these councils shall be held before Lent, so that the pure gift may be offered to God after all bitterness has been put away. And the second in the autumn. This is exactly the practice with which Leo grew up and which he continued, as we know, in his lifetime. Most likely, he held a bigger assembly with more people involved in the fall and a smaller assembly before Lent in the spring. Now, as a first part, I would like to look at various, let's call them phrases, paragraphs from his writings. This is from the letters of St. Leo, where he directly speaks to the question what synods are good for, what they should be doing, what they should not be doing. And there is what we could call a pragmatic phrase in a letter from 450. So that's a high kind of tension period between the failure of 449 and the new council of 451. And he says there to the Emperor Theodosius, if some men are at variance with the purity of our faith and the authority of the fathers, which are mostly the fathers of the Council of Chalcedon, of Nicaea, then may your clemency allow the holding of a universal council. So you see, he has to give in. And he kind of says, okay, if that's the case and can't do anything else, then we have another council. The first message, right? We have to be clear. Purity of faith and not chaotic. We have to stick to the authority of the fathers, which is the canons, the canonical authority, church order, truth and order. And those two things are really the overarching topics. This is what he wants, and this is what he wants to produce in the councils in which he is involved. A second thing is he wants to include more voices. More voices in the sense that he would like the holding of a universal council. So the quotation I just made continues like this: a universal council inside Italy. as the synod which met here in Rome to deal with this matter has joined me in requesting. Thus, when all come together, corrective measures may be planned. So one of the issues he has with the Eastern councils is they're too Eastern. We're not there, we can't really go. Let's have one over here for a change. And nearly, I'm not saying deviously, but smartly, he says, it's what the bishops want. The synod joins me in requesting this. This is his first attempt, right? He realizes, okay, we gotta have a council. The emperor doesn't budge, but let's have it here. He doesn't get his way, even though Theodosius dies, in a sense, providentially. But the new emperor, Marcian, and his wife Pulcheria, the sister of Theodosius, still go ahead with the council plan. And so now, again, he adapts. He says, your benevolence may recall that I asked that it be held in Italy, so that all the bishops in our region might assemble when summoned, if the safety of the times permitted. Which is, of course, one of the reasons that they didn't permit it, because the safety of the times at the time in Italy, not at the highest level. As he adapts, right, as we've seen from the 5 phases, he wants to guarantee and put in place reliable leadership for the council. So that, as opposed to 449, people can just say, well, let me be the head, right? And then ultimately hijack the council in a totally different direction. This is now a letter to the council fathers assembling in Chalcedon before they actually start. Nevertheless, your holiness may consider that I am presiding the council in these brothers, that is, Pascasinus and Lucentius the bishops, Boniface and Basil the priests, who have been sent by the Apostolic See, and that you are not then deprived of my presence. I am now present in the person of my vicars. Reliable leadership, because he wants to be sure we don't mess up on doctrine, we don't mess up on law, and we don't mess up on mercy. You see how this is also a Nicene kind of interest that Leo takes up. He says, I'm sending these delegates in letters so that the assembled brothers might know the procedure which must be followed at this judicial meeting, in order that no rashness may hinder the dogmas of our faith or canon law or the remedies suggested by kindness. You see, doctrine, law and order, and mercy need to be maintained. It can only be maintained together. If you take one out, the whole thing falls to pieces. Procedure is important. This is all, learning from the catastrophe of 449. And he reminds them and others directly, what we are doing here needs to be inspired by how Nicaea went. We need to learn from the great council of Nicaea, not only externally, but internally. And he says this about himself. The task has been entrusted to me, as it is marked down to my discredit of canonical arrangements set up under the guidance of the Spirit of God by the Holy Fathers at the Council of Nicaea, for the governing of the entire church, are violated with my connivance. May it not be so, right? Quod Deus avertat, so to say. This is the criticism, right, of the canon by which Constantinople gets promoted over Alexandria. And he never goes along with this. This is one of the criticisms. And he says, we need to stick to the rules of Nicaea because they are inspired. And in fact, inspiration and obedience by Nicaea is crucial. He repeats this again and again, a second quote, let no councils flatter themselves over having greater numbers present. And let no bishops, however numerous they may be, dare to compare or to prefer themselves to those 318 bishops. For the Council of Nicaea was blessed by God with so great a privilege that where the ecclesiastical decisions are rendered by fewer or more, anything decided contrary to what those bishops decreed is completely without authority. So Nicaea has this superior authority, right? Against it, nothing can prevail, never mind how many, because there are more participants in Chalcedon than they were at Nicaea, which some people said, okay, therefore it kind of overrules it. Leo says, no, Nicaea can never be overruled by anything. This is because God, gave it this great kind of normative privilege. And in how he proposes to deal with, let's say, what has been decreed at Chalcedon, he insists that there be no compromises, no meddling or muddling, clarity. And he knows we need to do some work here. This is nearly funny. This is to one of his greatest allies, Julian, of course, a bishop. We have no very clear information about the acts of the synod, which were drawn up at the time at the Council of Chalcedon, on account of the difference of language. And therefore, I especially enjoin upon you, brother, that you have the whole collected into one volume, accurately translated, of course, into Latin. The work, the papal secretaries at the secretariat at the time, the chancery, gets very organized. And so they pull together all these documents, and the Latin version is produced so that they can actually work with it. Before that, they weren't even clear what was decided. Julian, of course, who is clearly super bilingual, gets this job and executes it. And that enables Leo to really then deal with the reception of Chalcedon. For whatever is laid before bishops for inquiry beyond the particular subjects, which come before synodal councils, may admit of a certain amount of free discussion, if the Holy Fathers have laid down nothing thereon at Nicaea. For anything that is not in agreement with their rules and constitutions can never obtain the assent of the Apostolic See. Nicaea draws the lines, right? It determines the limits. And that which has been decided is not up ever for renegotiation. Leo declares himself not to be the one to, in a sense, determine what needs to be done and what needs to be taught, but he declares himself responsible for supporting and for defending the doctrines and the canons laid down by Nicaea. The assent is what the Holy See, what the Apostolic See gets to give. So this is not a kind of conciliar model by which the Pope substantially tells everyone what to do and they say yes, and then we move on. But the Holy See is the verifier of whether what has been discussed and decreed goes together with Nicaea or not. And one of the key issues still, we saw it in the canon in Nicaea itself, and is still present in Leo himself, is to keep the door to reconciliation always open. Nothing should linger in anyone's mind in disagreement with the utterances of either the prophets or the apostles. Such moderation, of course, being observed, that only the persistent rebels should be cast off from the unity of the church. And no one who was penitent should be denied pardon. Now, the change being, while Nicaea mostly spoke about lapsi, so people who fell away from the faith during persecution, this is now no longer the case. Now it is heretics, mostly Christological heretics, who, however, also must always be readmitted to the church if they are penitent, or let's say, unless they are totally obstinate, persistent rebels, he calls them here. Listen to everyone. Another interesting, very late, you see, this is a letter to the Bishop of Ravenna from 458. He dies in 61. At a synodal meeting, so this would be a regional synod, as we have said, we have received a formal request for advice on this matter. And in carefully discussing it, we have desired to weigh each member's opinion and to handle it in so cautious a manner as to arrive with certainty at the truth by making use of the knowledge of many. Seems like a straightforward sentence, right? But what it implies is actually quite, well, important. The first one may be that the desire is to arrive at the truth, and that is conceived as something reachable. And in order to do so, everyone gets to speak, all the bishops. It sounds nearly like a bit of an innovation, but this is how the council in Rome, the Synod of Rome, proceeded. All the bishops, every bishop got to say. And they do it because they've received a request from outside. And this becomes the basis for how the Synod ultimately then makes a decision and makes a decree. Listen to everyone. Remember his other attempt of having the Latin bishops included, who otherwise couldn't join a synod if it's held in the East. So having in mind, how we have these kind of various utterances among the letters, we take a step back in how Leo starts his mission and his ministry as the Pope. And my suspicion is, not only mine, that this is how it went. In 440, Leo is on a mission in Gaul. Two very important politicians, Aetius, the Magister Militum, so the supreme commander of the military, and Albinus, the Praetorian prefect, so the prime minister, were about to start one more civil war. They were very popular in late antiquity. The emperors and others went at each other frequently. Leo goes out trying to, stop that in Gaul, not in Italy, even beyond Italy. So in a sense, we have here two things, right? The very mission tells us how the authority, the prestige of the Roman Church and the Roman bishop in whose name he operates has grown so that he is seen as the only one who can get anywhere with these two guys. And secondly, it is also about his person. I mean, he was sent. The Bishop of Rome could have sent someone else, but he sent Leo. So clearly this is a testament to his ability to represent, to mediate, to reconcile. And then in the middle of August, who knows, a heat wave, Pope Sixtus dies. Leo is in Gaul. And now we make a visit to the Lateran Basilica. Remember, the Cathedral of Rome, the Basilica of the Savior and of Saints John the Baptist and the Evangelist at the Lateran. This is where everyone is. It's the 29th of September, 440. The Roman clergy is there, the people are there, bishops from the province must have been there. They're all assembled. And surprise, surprise, Leo becomes Pope. And at his ordination, he gives the first sermon that we have from him, Tractatus 1 in the collection. In this Tractatus, he speaks about election to the papacy from God as a blessing, beneficia, he calls it, and as a challenge. It's a ministry, obsequia, you need to do what you're told by God ultimately. But it is an election that also comes from the community. And he describes the relationship of the community to him as affectio, favoris arbitrium. They wanted it, they desired him to be Pope, desideria. So on the one hand, we have here an Augustinian theology of grace ultimately, where there are no merits, nullis precedentibus meritis, applied to the episcopate. So no longer is this theology only applied to being baptized, but now in a sense transformed and transferred to the episcopate. In the second homily, he will say the papacy is a gift, an honor, it's unmerited, it's a dignity. But on the other hand, we do not have something that we see in Augustine, namely the whole office is burdensome and I can't really deal with it and I don't really want it. Leo doesn't say that here. But what he does say from the beginning and in all the sermons is, I need your help. I need your support, he says to the Romans and to the bishops present. I need your support and your prayer. The Latin words there are reverentiae, amoris et fidei studia, juvate votis. So help me with your prayers. Because you have asked for this, this is the reply. This is in a sense the answer to your prayers. So now you have to help me with your prayers in order for me to be a good bishop. In the first sermon, no word about St. Peter, zero. The focus is totally on the Lord, Christus Dominus, and on the priesthood. Maybe also because he gives this sermon in the Lateran Church, which is specifically dedicated to Christ the Savior. But it all begins then, and I just point out a few things that show how Leo from the beginning has let's call it a broad vision, right? one that is not just he and Jesus, but that involves others in order for this to even work. He speaks about prayer frequently, the prayer of the Pope and the people together. And then certainly he asks for their prayers constantly, kind of a prayer for each other between the pastor and his community. He expresses gratitude, yes, to God first, but also to the community, and not only to God. And from the beginning, even in the first sermons, he has this concern for unity, and they pray for unity, for peace. This is probably also a peace that surrounds, right? It's not simply given in Italy at the time, but also in the church itself. Studia unanimitatis. We need to agree on the core doctrines. And though not mentioned, of course, in the first and in the second, other bishops must have been present. Otherwise, how would he have been ordained? He doesn't talk to those bishops specifically, unimaginable today, of course. But they must have been present. So even this first sermon is given also to bishops and not just to regular Christians. 1 year later, another visit to Rome, but now we are at the Vatican. This is, a drawing of how St. Peter looked like before the Renaissance messed it up. This is now the 29th September of 441, the first anniversary, the famous Natale. So the anniversary of his ordination, Leo gives the second. And then in following years, the third, the fourth, and the fifth sermon in the collection of his works. And we now see how Roman synodality actually worked and felt and sounded like. Leo now says, I am presiding an assembly of venerable brother bishops, venerabilium consacerdotum frequentiam, and they are membra excellentissima corporis Christi. So quite, solemn language. In this assembly, as he now tries to, in a sense, describe, St. Peter himself is also present. He is active, he is venerated, he is the source, what a beautiful phrase, of ecclesial love and order. Ordinatissimam totius ecclesiae caritatem. The most ordered love of the whole church. And he himself is present, in a sense, because he is Peter's heir, unworthy heir. He doesn't stand on the same level. Yet, he has the job, the mission, the obligation to preside over the church. The language is quite strong. Gubernaculis ecclesiae praesidere. He doesn't, none of this servant ministry kind of language that we have today. He says, no, I have to be in charge. This is how it has to go. The fall synods, right? They appear as very regular. This is Nicene practice. They are recurring events. They are mentioned in following years. Always the bishops are there. The question maybe becomes whether this synod was already the place and the time of Leo's election. So concretely, did they meet because of his ordination? Or were they meeting anyway for the synod and they ordained him? And then a second historical question is, did Leo move the synod from the Lateran to the Vatican? We really don't know the answer to these questions, but he may have, right? Clearly, all the future synods we know in his time are held at St. Peter's tomb because he makes reference to it repeatedly, as many other celebrations are. So Leo is clearly a fan of the Vatican Basilica. Roman synodality, as we see now, as it emerges from his writings, and now that includes very much the sermons, ends up finally mentioning the burden and the duties and the dangers of his office. Honorat et obstringit, offensionis occasio, laboris portio. So this now, 5 years, whatever, 7 years, 12 years, we don't exactly know the date of the fifth sermon. Sounds much more Augustinian, and maybe due to how he is now working with Prosper of Aquitaine, one of the most, let's just say, committed Augustinians at the time. And the burdens largely come from his responsibilities outside of Rome. Ad beati apostoli Petri sedem ex toto orbe concurritur. From the whole world, they come to the see of St. Peter, say with their difficulties and troubles. That's what makes his life hard. Many of these questions that are brought to him, he does not answer. Instead, he brings them to the synod, not just to the papal chancery to get out a quick answer. So there is a real kind of synodal reality going on. And in fact, the synodal responsibilities, he is convinced, he says in a homily, can only be discharged with Christ's help, who is not only custos ovium, so the one who takes care of the sheep, but he is also pastor pastorum. When you look at this homily, you might say, okay, the Christians need help, but the bishops, they seem to need much more help in doing, in their, executing their office and discharging their duties. For Leo, Peter's guidance, right? There is a real piety towards St. Peter in Leo. His guidance, his moderation guarantees that the synod will make the right decision. And again and still, it is especially about decisions whether or not to grant penance for those condemned and forgiveness for those reconciled. So the heritage of Nicaea is still very much alive. I repeat, now it is very much about heretics to be readmitted. The Romans and their synods, and Leo most of all, are bound to the doctrine, to the example, and to the support, the help of Peter, who is the true praesul, the true bishop of the Roman Church and of her synods. This is, in a sense, how he invokes him in those sermons that he gives. Sermon 2 in particular, when Leo speaks about Peter, and thus about himself as heres, as lieutenant of Peter, as heir of Peter, he speaks to the bishops. They, in a sense, are reminded of how the structure looks. For the Roman clergy and the Roman Christian, this is not contentious. And is it going? Yes, it is. We now, of course, reading these words, these phrases, we can say, well, is this just rhetorical? Is this just some ideological Überbau, right? According to which Leo just wants to justify and cement his own power, right? The super metropolitical and universal power, later we would call it jurisdiction. I mean, this is, you can easily see how a good old Marxist reading says, okay, this is just him wanting to be in charge, right? If you don't take seriously any of the piety, any of the faith that he shows in Christ and in St. Peter, of whom he is the heir, I think it's better to take seriously where we are, the location, right? The location for these 4 sermons, just as for sermons 82 and many other occasions, especially fast occasions, is the basilica with the tomb of St. Peter. So the Peter that he invokes is, right there in front of him. The tomb, the whole basilica is a monument to this apostle. So brushing it aside, right? Hard. At the Vatican, devotion to Peter appears very real, very alive. To simply say, well, that's not real, nothing's behind those assertions, is weak, even historically weak, certainly theologically weak. It's felt like a physical presence. The body is there. Certainly a spiritual presence. Peter's tomb, in fact, is depicted as the focal point of synodical and spiritual life for the Roman Catholics at the time. The synod assembles there, and they assemble there for many other occasions. In those homilies, he works out the biblical basis, makes reference to Matthew 16, to Luke 12, to John 21, and as is typical for Leo, he takes the biblical language and the terms, Petra, fundamentum. He also takes typically Roman Latin legal concepts, such as potestas, auctoritas, sedes. He mixes, some of them are mixed. They appear in both realities. And of course, he combines them freely. This is typical for his language, and this is typical for how, in fact, his theology works, his thinking works, his rhetorics also work. The Petrine synodality, as I call it, therefore, at the synods and in the church generally, makes Leo preside because Peter presides. And that happens because this is how Christ instituted it. The basis being this unique relationship that Leo sees to exist between Peter and Christ. One time he calls it indeficiens cum eterno sacerdote consortium. An unbreakable society, an unbreakable kind of joint venture with the eternal high priest. That's what St. Peter has. For the assembled people, for the bishops at the synod, and for himself, Peter is an example to be imitated, a teacher to be followed, and a supporter and intercessor, whose words, actions, dispositions, right, even the character, are not only a vague model, but they're normative. Peter's confessio, first and foremost, of faith is normative. Its content, veritas, but also its stability. You could say stubbornness. It's not changing, culminating in his martyrdom, in fact. He is so faithful that ultimately, so much firmitas, so much fortitudo, that ultimately he could and did die for it. But this also applies to the penitential discipline that never shuts the door to reconciliation. Remember, Peter is a model penitent. After the denial, he receives forgiveness. So the door to reconciliation is always open because the power, to bind and absolve, the potestas legandi et solvendi, is received from Christ, and it transcends human forgiveness. So Christ is more merciful than a normal human court, a human judgment would be. Leo's experiences at the Roman synods, therefore, before, during his papacy, are formative for how he understands synods generally. He transposes as much as he can the Roman experiences to the universal level. But there will come the famous problem, right? This is now from letter 33, which he sends in 449. The Tomus ad Flavianum, for him, is the way forward. So for those who don't know, the Tomus ad Flavianum is his big letter to the Bishop of Constantinople, outlining the major tenets, the major principles of doctrine concerning Christ's incarnation, his divinity and his humanity. And Leo goes full Monty, you might say, in disseminating this Tomus to everyone. So he doesn't give up. I mean, they kind of disregarded it at the Council of Ephesus, and he says, never mind. And he sends it out to everyone who cares. Monks, the whole council, the emperors, the imperial family receive multiple copies. These are in letters 29 to 32, all to bolster the thing for the future, in a sense. And in this Tomus, right, he says, listen, this is not so complicated. The confession of Peter, in fact, alone is a concise answer to the question about the faith in Christ, which the council needs to deal with. Plenitudinem fidei brevi sermone complexus. He says, use this and you can't go astray. This confession is exemplary and it is normative for the new council. But already 33, he says, implies, let's say, that it may not be exactly enough to simply repeat it. We need more explanation. We might need some further elucidation. But in substance, it's all there. The point of the council, therefore, is not to renegotiate, but it is, a deeper and broader reception and understanding. Both negatively, you repudiate the errors, ultimately you anathemize certain doctrines, but also positively, you formulate the right doctrine clearly and correctly. In 449, Leo feels, okay, the letter is good, but I'm also sending some people. So they should also be there. The Latin is ut inter sint. A couple of Romans to sit in the meeting, so to say. Well, not enough, as we then know. The strategy fails, and he had invested quite a bit. Many letters to all kinds of people. His own legates are out there, and yet, boom, the whole thing goes belly up. And so in the future, he will not repeat exactly the same strategy. Instead, he will invest in his contacts with and his influence on the imperial family even more. And the imperial family, thanks be to God, he probably said, changed. The new couple, much more receptive. But he will also invest more in other ecclesial players. He will demand that his legates not only be there and shut up, so to say, but preside, not just attend. We have seen the quote already. And last not least, he at first wants to have the council closer to himself. In Italy, to have more people there, right? Not so many difficult guys from the East, more people who are less confused from the West. We see, therefore, emerge, I would say, some principles of this Petrine synodality. When Leo speaks about the church, she primarily appears as the church of Christ. Right? I mean, for us, this may be obvious, but it is not. It is first of all the church of Christ. It is secondarily the apostolic church. And that, in his case, very concretely means the church of St. Peter, not just vaguely apostolic. And then only, it's also the church of the fathers, of the councils, and of the empire. Pretty much in that order. This is good theology. This is hard to beat ecclesiologically. For synods in particular to be fruitful and not to end in catastrophe, we need fidelity. We need fidelity to Christ, and we need trust in Christ and in St. Peter. And on the other hand, we need realism about how things have to be done, how they have to be prepared, and yes, how they have to be organized. Remember, procedure even he mentions. After the Ephesian disaster of 449, Leo does not only want a new attempt, second attempt, Council 2.0. He wants a really new approach, a new and improved model of council. And that means the new council, upcoming in Chalcedon, is more strictly bound to the apostolic faith, as expressed already in the Thomus, which is based on Peter's confession and on the Apostolicum, so the Apostolic Creed, just as everyone else is. So it's nothing special here, including himself or the emperor. Less deviation from that. And the question of who presides becomes more important. Practically, and at least you might say in principle, we can't presume, we have to assume that he didn't really get his way, right? I mean, the emperors still were very much in charge of the council, but in principle, he said, I am in charge through the people I sent to you. But behind this question, which is not just about honorary precedence, really appears the issue of fidelity again and of authority. Presiding is the place of Peter. That's exactly what Peter did. And therefore, at the council, his heir has to preside, even if he can't do it personally, and has to send people who take his place. Leo's contribution, therefore, wants to be, I call it, robust presence. Not just vague, like supervision from afar, but he wants to be right there in the middle, at least through his delegates. Presiding, so that he cannot be railroaded again like in 449. The words again are strong. Regere, regere. So rule, govern, preside. And fortitudo is required in order to do this well. He also wants to be there as a reminder of what is up to us and what is not up to us. Important role. The words there, already known from other contexts, Petra, firmitas. We're not negotiating everything. Certain things are beyond us. Concretely, right, this means he's the representative of apostolic doctrine and authority. Insuperabilis fides. The faith of St. Peter as such cannot be improved upon. Peter does, in fact, speak through Leo. I mean, he's actually convinced of that himself pretty much. It's not just some kind of solemn declaration which the council shouts out. He wants to be a witness to the deep continuity between the gospel and the profession of faith, or more fully, the continuity between gospels, so the voice of Christ, the apostles, especially Peter, the symbols, especially the apostolic symbol and the one of Nicaea, and then the fathers of the church. And between those, right, and based on those, rests the soliditas fidei, the stable, robust, unshakable faith. It is, in fact, exactly this schema, is at least my interpretation, gospel, apostles, symbol, fathers, that for Leo is foundational and fundamental. The auctoritas patrum, so assembled bishops at synod, depends altogether on their fidelity to the apostolic faith, of which it has to be an expression. See his own collection of texts, right? When he sends out his long letters, he appends a collection of texts, quotations from the fathers to say, listen, this is not, I didn't come up with this. Look, the great authors all agree on this. Scripture, apostles, symbola, they are in agreement and they have the priority over new and later expressions that now the synods or the bishops can come up with. This coherence between those four, right, is logically necessary so that the faith is one, not just bits and pieces or many faiths. But it's also the condition for the faith to be soteriologically effective. Because if it's not the faith in the Savior, who is God and at the same time man, right, one person, two natures, no salvation can be effected by it. And that salvation already now begins, in a sense, because that faith is the ground on which rests the unity and the peace of the church. It's not just for future eschatological realities. The schema delineates, you might say hermeneutically, the space into which all expressions of the faith need to fit. If they don't fit, they're not good expressions. And in this space, they can be and have to be interpreted, and when necessary, clarified. Outside, you go astray. It is this massive cohesion, you might say, and continuity where this all works. The realm of continuity and coherence among gospel, apostles, symbol, fathers, it does allow for different wordings, for different expressions of the one faith, but it always has to be the faith in one and the same Christ, unus idemque Christus, in his two natures. A similar schema, you might say, exists between Christ, Peter, and Leo himself and the other bishops. He's convinced, he says it directly, certain people have specific responsibilities in the church, the bishops, the emperors, the monks, himself is the lieutenant of Peter. At the same time, there is a basic foundational equality among those who share the royal priesthood of Christ, as, interestingly, St. Peter teaches. And the synods, they are directed by Christ. If they follow all these conditions, they are directed by Christ, even against all odds, precisely when and as much as they respect the apostolic tradition. Because this, right, respect for the apostolic tradition is how they rely on the help of Christ. So he's very concrete here. It's not just vague, well, let's have a prayer and then do what we like. No, we rely on Christ's help by relying on the apostolic tradition. This is how we assure ourselves of the help of the one who assumed and glorified our nature. And Peter appears as the symbol and model of this fidelity and of this reliance on Christ, on his grace. This, in fact, constitutes the basis for his authority, which then is in turn the source and the model of all potestas in the church, be it of the Pope, the Roman bishop, or of any other bishop. An interesting kind of way of looking at this from slightly a different angle is how Leo speaks about inspiration. Because sometimes today in theology, we have a bit of an antagonism between Christological, principles and pneumatological principles. By the way, and anywhere when this comes up, the alarm bells should ring, right? Loudly. Instead, right, Leo looks at this in this way. Despite all the trust that he has, right, in tradition, the fondness of older formulations, Leo sees a need for theological clarification. I mean, he writes 3 long doctrinal letters. I mean, clearly he has seen a need for something. And you could say, in this sense, there is a development, even in his own thinking. Inspiration, to which he often makes reference for Leo, means getting connected to the stream of revelation and tradition. So inspiration is not some kind of corrective to the tradition by which it is somehow balanced, right, between old and new. You can see how there are models out there in contemporary theology that go this way. This is not how Leo looks at it. Inspiration itself is understood as what produces fidelity. The truly inspired are inspired to be faithful. And that in turn becomes the condition for authentic development as opposed to betrayal, as opposed to giving up on the true faith in the one mediator between God and man. Being inspired means the true faith prevails in me, so that I can help it to prevail in others, at synods, in the whole church. This is then how councils can be seen as epiphanies and victories of Christ. Tradition is inspired. To be part of tradition is being inspired and alive. We want to be careful, right? At the surface, Leo seems just so traditional. People would today say conservative. He doesn't want to make any changes. But it is not a naive refusal of development. Once you look at his texts and at his letters, precisely by going back, right? By going back to Nicaea and even beyond Nicaea, to the witness of the apostle himself, he engages in what I call a kind of apostolic ressourcement. Back to the very beginning. He builds, therefore, the new council on Petrine foundations, and this, in the case of Chalcedon, successfully, will lead to a pluralism of councils that have similar authority as Nicaea. So we're not stuck with Nicaea alone, which would be, if you think about it, nearly a Protestant declaration, solum Nicenum. But instead, other councils can follow, but they need to follow and stand on Nicaea as the foundation. Leo's intentional fidelity to the apostolic legacy leads de facto to doctrinal development. That is certainly true at Chalcedon and after Chalcedon, because in the coming decades, the hypostatic union will actually be worked out. But already in himself, there is a certain learning curve, a certain development. Leo's leadership for all of this is crucial, and this is what he is really good at. He has no illusions about the limits, the conditions of his influence, especially on the imperial synods held in the East, as we saw. He invests in allies and in co-workers, legates, bishops, super bishops, like the patriarchs will be later called, emperors, vicars that he installs in various parts of the world. He insists directly on the metropolitans exercising their own responsibility, their own leadership in their own provinces and in their own synods. His mission, he describes as, I am the custos fidei et canonum. I am the one to, protect, to guard the faith and the canonical order. But it is not some kind of supreme high command. It's not even the later, primacy of jurisdiction. But it follows the example and the doctrines of Peter. And those are therefore, he feels therefore, embedded in ecclesial and synodical structures and traditions. I cannot help point here to what Benedict XVI said before he was Pope and then also while he was Pope on the limits of papal power. Because sometimes I think today we believe there are no limits, but there are, big time, something to recognize and rediscover from the writings of St. Leo. For Leo, the question concretely is not whether or not someone is leading a council and presiding, but who? Who and how? Leo's leadership, therefore, rests on a concept of synodality that should help us today, realizing that pitching a synodal against a primatial ecclesiology is a false dichotomy. I would have stronger language, but I'm refraining myself. Intentional fidelity is the soul of it all. Intentional fidelity to tradition is the condition of the church being a space of reconciliation, a space of conversion, and a space of charity, right? For sinners, for heretics, for the poor. In other words, obedience. Obedience to divine revelation, even against political convenience, or even against pressure, even against things that seem useful for the life of the church immediately. Obedience to divine revelation. Intentional fidelity is the key. The condition for the church being unified in peace, being true to her mission, and being able to communicate divine forgiveness and ultimately divine salvation. Papal authority over synods and bishops is real. Already he speaks about himself as speculator, which is actually a translation of bishop, right? And rector of those things. So he's in charge. But he's in charge for this purpose. He's in charge in order to ground the proceedings and the outcomes of the synods on the mission and on the virtues of St. Peter. And in my perception, three kind of stand out: fidelity, moderation, and clarity. Now, for the synodical life today, these three still seem very promising. And in fact, they seem promising because first and foremost, and through this Petrine model, it is all about following, imitating, and trusting in Christ. I leave you with a better picture of the Council of Nicaea, at least potentially the Council of Nicaea, where you see the assembly of the bishops, including the emperor in a sense. But at the center is neither the papal legate nor the emperor. In the center is Christ and his cross. Thank you.